No. I mean,
Right on the minute. Okay, you'll do it.
in November, these two fingers numb the tingling. Is that something that's a real possibility? Oh, you know what the diagnosis is? Like carpal tunnel syndrome, or it's called cubital. Is it a cause or just aging or whatever? I don't know what.
Welcome you all back to Hope Church Adult Ed. I was telling Steve as we were talking that I so appreciate his taking on some of the most difficult, heart-challenging, belief-challenging questions that we face in life. I deal with the easy, empirically solvable questions. He's helping. He has the courage to help us with really difficult questions. And we were talking about some of these really, just devastating experiences that some of us have had, losing mothers, as Steve himself did, prematurely. I can think of people in this congregation that we've lost prematurely with great heartache. He was telling us last week a story of Jennifer Kasunik, a Hope student who I happen to know because we often shared adjacent booths at breakfast in Phelps Dining Hall. I can tell you she was somebody whose personality would light up a room. I mean, by reputation, she entered the room and the joy level in that room went up. What he also didn't mention is Jennifer was blind. She read by Braille. She was accompanied everywhere by her seeing-eyed dog. And so she was probably the most visible student to other Hope students among the 3,000 students. And thus, it was just catastrophic to have her life wiped out in an instant, as it was on that railroad crossing day. And then the president asked, why would God allow such a thing? And so he didn't answer the question, but we have Steve here to help us think about the answer to such questions. As I mentioned last week, Steve is a summa cum laude graduate of Hope, at MDiv from Western. He has a doctorate in Christian ethics from Duke. He has been a leader, he's been a pastor and a leader of church commissions in the RCA. He's won about every teaching award possible at Hope. And we saw an example of that last week in the clarity and kindness that marks all his interactions. And people so appreciated that, Steve, as they were mentioning to me afterwards. So thank you so much for coming back and taking on this really difficult topic.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you. This is a second session that picks up sort of where the other one left off. So if you weren't here last week, I have a few little reminders that might orient you to what we did last week, but I think there are a lot of familiar faces here from last week too. So last week we talked about the intellectual dilemma that is often referred to as the problem of evil. And that dilemma essentially is God is good, God is all-powerful, and evil exists. So the reason it's a dilemma is because it's hard to say that evil would exist in a world governed by a good and all-powerful God. Right? And you can, as I illustrated, eliminate that conflict by getting rid of any of the propositions. But if you stop and think about it, it's hard to deny any of those. Although today, I'm going to suggest a way to revise one of those, following some somewhat recent thought in the last decade. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. Let's here. I never teach with PowerPoint, so. Yeah, you're the old school. So I'll try to remember to change that when necessary. So the question today is the question, how is God at work in the world? And if I knew your answer to that question, I probably would be able to guess with pretty good accuracy how you would respond to the problem of evil. Because the answer to that question has very clear implications for how one would respond to the problem of evil. For example, if you believe that God's all-powerful, in total control of everything, it probably means that you're going to have to say something like, everything happens for a reason. Everything bad happens for some good reason that God must have in the background. Right? And so in the end, everything that happens because it's controlled by a good God in a way that somehow is part of God's final plan. Now that's a very familiar response to the problem of evil. And it's such a familiar response, I think, because it's so common for us to want to affirm God's goodness and God's power. So just by way of previewing what's going to happen today, let's see here. The question we're going to ask today is in the third paragraph. What kind of power does God actually have? And the suggestion that's made by several authors is that God is very powerful enough even to redeem this mess of a world from evil. But this very powerful God is not currently in total control of what's happening. So that's a pretty stark claim, isn't it? It asks you to think about revising God as all-powerful to something other than that. And so using several authors, I'm going to sort of walk you through what that revision might look like. And then suggest a practical response to the problem of evil rather than a theoretical response to the problem of evil. So, somewhat long ago, 1981, Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote this book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He emphasizes he's not answering why, but he does address the why question a little bit in one of the chapters. And so I'm just going to review a little bit of what he said in 1981, because what's been said in a couple important books lately, like How God Acts and The Uncontrolling Love of God, picks up where Kushner was starting, though he doesn't go in much detail about that. These books go into tremendous detail about that. So what did Kushner say? He said, bad things happen to good people because laws of nature That's key. Laws of nature treat everyone alike. So a bullet, for example, has no conscience. The laws of nature take over once a bullet is fired. And the same thing is true for a malignant tumor or an automobile gone out of control. Right? It's not God who's controlling those things at that point. It's nature that's controlling those things at that point. That's Kushner's argument. So he says that God does not reach down to interrupt the workings of nature to protect the righteous from harm. Now, Kushner's title might seem a little strange. When bad things happen to good people, it sort of implies that if bad things happen to bad people, right, maybe that would be okay. I think a better way to think about his title now is when bad things happen to people God loves, who of course are good people and bad people. So let's just a couple more quotes from Kushner here. He says, and you might have thought about this before if you ever heard this phrase, insurance companies refer to natural disasters as acts of God. But he says, I don't believe that an earthquake that kills thousands of innocent victims without reason is an act of God. It's an act of nature. Nature is morally blind, without values. It churns along following its own laws, not caring who or what gets in the way. And then death, again, because a lot of us, when we experience the problem of evil, it's in conjunction, as David pointed out, with the death of someone we love, a death that's premature especially. So he says, death is one of the given conditions of life. We can't control it, and sometimes we can't even postpone it. All we can do is try to rise beyond the question, why did it happen? Because, he would say, we can't know why it happened. And then instead of asking that question, we should begin to ask the question, what do I do now that it has happened? And the end of his book has a really good chapter about thinking about that question instead. Okay, so how is God at work in the world? I'm going to suggest for our session today that we think about it this way. The insights from science suggest an answer to that question. And the answer to that question would go something like this. God created the kind of world in which God is, by God's choice, no longer in total control of present events. Neither moral evil, which we talked about last time, or natural evil. And we'll look at both of those in just a bit. Instead, God created a world in which there's space for natural processes to happen without divine intervention. Consider what we learned from the study of biology, chemistry, physics, meteorology, and the success of all of the technologies that use that knowledge. Scientists typically, I think, see processes happening naturally, right, without the need in billions of cases probably every minute for God to intervene in that process. And the reason God doesn't need to intervene, these authors suggest, is because God created the kind of world that didn't require that constant intervention. Right? But it leaves God out of a big piece of life, right? And we'll keep looking at how God gets left out. Okay, last week when we talked about comfort phrases, I suggested that those 4 categories of comfort phrases expressed the typical categories of theodicy. But I didn't mention, and nobody called me on this, I didn't mention the very common response, free will. And the reason I didn't mention it is because it fits in here way better than it fit in last week. And here's the reason. The free will defense, like why is there evil, right, in a world governed by an all-powerful God? Because of free will. The free will defense defends God against the claim that God is responsible for evil by saying that evil isn't caused by God. It's caused by people. Human choices and the actions that result from human choices. And those are possible because God gave us free will. Now, this free will response solves the problem of evil, just like the other comfort phrases do, by qualifying one of the propositions. But it doesn't qualify the last proposition, like almost all the other comfort phrases did, that evil exists. It qualifies the proposition that God is all-powerful. It doesn't necessarily reject the idea that God is powerful, but it rejects the idea that God is in total control. God doesn't cause everything. It's because humans with free will have the capacity to make choices, engage in actions that cause evil. So the free will response says to us, if we're trying to blame God for this, like, don't blame God. The sinful choices and actions of people are the cause, not God. So the free will response clearly addresses the question, how is God at work in the world, by making a claim, a significant claim, about how God is not at work in the world. It carves out a space. I think that's a helpful way to think about it. It carves out a space where human causation is at work, not divine causation. Now, we can talk about that later. That doesn't satisfy everyone. And let me just point out now, there's a potential problem, like free will is God's fault. God created it. If an all-knowing God created free will, then isn't God responsible for evil? Sort of like you make a bad product and you have a recall. Right? And then there are a lot of responses to that argument. We can go there. I'll ask my colleague, Professor Bauma-Prediger, maybe to help me with some of the defenses of the free will response. But we might not have time to go there. Okay, so if free will is real, like it's not just an illusion, it's not like we're puppets on a string thinking we're making decisions, but not actually making the decisions. If free will is real, then there's a wide range of suffering that God doesn't cause and that God doesn't control, right? And you could add to my list, right? Injustice, oppression, war, racism, and all the varieties of ways people oppress and hurt each other. So, the free will response doesn't explain hurricanes or tsunamis, right? It's about moral evil. And moral evil is half of what we mean by evil if you think about the way we divided those up last week. Because it's hard to find a causal link between human choices and earthquakes and tsunamis. These natural events have caused massive amounts of death and destruction, and they're an example of what we call natural evil. Now, there is a way that free will has some impact on natural events, like the climate crisis, right? We see wildfires, and we think wildfires, like how are humans responsible for that? Well, we know a little bit about how humans are responsible for a lot of the weather issues that happen, right? So sometimes there's a connection, but there's a lot of, and maybe even cancer, right? Maybe it's caused by, it seems over the years it's caused by virtually everything we eat. So there are some connections, but there's a lot of natural evil that it would be very difficult to connect to human free will. And to satisfy several of the social scientists in the room, I probably need to say, the free will response doesn't require us to assert absolute freedom because humans create history and culture. Right? They've done that for thousands and thousands of years. And history and culture have a lot of impact on the kinds of choices we make now. Right? So it's not like we're totally free in a vacuum. We're not in a vacuum. We're in a context of history and culture. So our freedom, in some ways, is constrained, right? It's not absolute. However, it's constrained by social realities that humans have created. right? So it's still part of this big picture. Okay, so let's turn to natural evil. The authors who talk about natural evil in this way talk about an open and relational understanding of God in the world. And that's what especially Edwards and Thomas J. Ord talk about in these books. In fact, the subtitle of Ord's book is An Open and Relational Account of Providence. So we need to think about what open means and what relational means. Just to preview what's coming, open is a way of thinking about how God's not totally controlling all the events that happen in the world. Relational is a way of seeing God as still involved in some important ways, even though God's not totally controlling it all, right? So open and relational. So in the classic problem of evil, which I summarized at the beginning of class, and which we talked about at length last time, God is almighty, typically understood God as being in total control. And if that didn't mean God was causing it, it implies that God's chosen to stand by and let it happen, right? So God's in control either way. And that makes God responsible for everything that happens, both good and evil. And in the case of natural evil, the free will option doesn't apply, although maybe in some ways that I just alluded to a minute ago. So if God's not responsible for natural evil, if humans aren't responsible for natural evil, then that makes God look even more responsible. So there's the problem. And how does this approach respond to that problem? It asks a question like, but what if God is not in total control of the natural world? What might that look like? Now you can just stop and think for a moment, like you don't have to raise your hands or anything. Do you think God is in total control of every process that happens, like biological and physical and all of that? Or do you think that God doesn't control that on a day-to-day basis? So your answer to that question will probably say something about what you're going to think about what's coming next, right? And you don't have to agree with what's coming next. I just think that these authors provide us a helpful way of considering the problem of evil perhaps a bit differently than we have before. Okay, what if God's not in total control? So, in light of modern scientific understandings of the world, it has been suggested that we understand the natural world as open and God's interaction with it as relational rather than controlling. And that's why Ord's book is The Uncontrolling Love of God. God's power, Ord would say, is the power of love. But love doesn't control, right? So love does some other very important things. And in fact, as I'll say in a little bit later, there are a lot of things in the Christian tradition that might suggest that love is the power God has to redeem the world, right? And so we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, let's see here. I'm going to just make sure. So an open and relational approach fully acknowledges what we learn from science about how the world works. Now, what do we learn from science? You've all had some science education. We have some scientists, like PhD level scientists in the room, right, who know a lot about what science does and how science works. So the assumption here is we probably know enough about science to realize that science answers a lot of the questions about how the world works. And probably when we don't know the answer, we assume that science might someday figure out the answer to how something works. Like a physician, right, might not know the answer to certain disease processes, but we hope that we'll figure out what those are and then figure out ways to address those. So again, we have several physicians in the room too. And Dorothy Zola will compliment physicians at the end of the session. The future is open, these authors suggest, rather than predetermined. This is because of human free will. Like, you might have a decision to make later today that will have some significant impact on the world. But if you're sort of in a quandary about what way to decide that, right, the future is open until you make that decision. And again, if it's free will, God's not making that decision for you. You're freely making it on your own, right? So that's an example of why the future is open. The natural processes God built into creation also lead to consequences that cannot be known in advance, right? So maybe the weather is a good example of that. Like, is it going to be hot or cold this week? Well, yeah, it's going to change kind of every day because we live in Michigan. But we don't know in advance what the weather is going to be like 2 weeks from now, right? Because natural processes will determine that. And so I grew up thinking that if you were going to have a picnic, you ought to pray to God asking that it be a nice, warm, sunny day. This suggests probably won't make a difference, right? So we can't know what people will do in advance, and we can't know what nature will do in advance. So there's this sort of built-in openness about the future. And that openness, it's important to acknowledge, given this way of thinking, means that God doesn't necessarily determine that. Now, does God know that? Sometimes people get caught up. If God knows the future, like, let's say the whole future is like a movie that God's already seen, and we say to God, what's going to happen next year? God says, oh, like I've seen next year already, let me tell you what's going to happen. But we could say that about a movie we've seen 5 times as well. But it doesn't mean we've made that thing happen. It just means we've seen it happen, right, as a result of the unfolding processes. So the future is not determined by God, and some suggest, depending on your view of God's absolute knowledge, maybe not even known by God. So creation, this is very important. If you're thinking about buying into this way of thinking, creation is an act of self-limitation on the part of God. Right? Why isn't God in total control? Because God has chosen not to be in total control. Because God has created a kind of world intentionally that doesn't require God being in total control. Now, we might wish that God was in total control because maybe we'd live in a very different world than we do, right? But we live in a world full of evil and suffering. And it's unimaginable, I think, to most of us, how a good God could be allowing on purpose all of that. So all created nature is allowed to be itself because it's given its creaturely freedom by God who created it. God does not will evil to happen. As a result of the unfolding of natural processes, evil just happens. I'm only looking at my notes because as I went over and over this, sometimes I wrote in a special comment I wanted to add. Okay, so God created a world that doesn't require God's constant intervention, and this view is open, and it can be connected to what is sometimes also called a non-interventionist view of God's causal relationship to the world. And Dennis Edwards' book talks a lot about the non-interventionist approach, which is probably very different than what most of us were brought up to think. Like when I was young, I used to think God always intervened. And David brought up again today my mother's death at age 45 when I was a Hope College freshman. That's when I stopped thinking that God intervened, right? Because God didn't intervene despite hundreds of prayers on her behalf, right? So now maybe that doesn't prove anything. I'm just but sort of existentially for me, it made less sense to think that God intervened, because if God wasn't going to intervene then, right, so when we discover through scientific investigation these wondrous and complex ways that are built into the way the world works, it's suggested that we're actually witnessing the complexity, wonder, and greatness of God. So a world that sort of works in all the complex ways it does doesn't necessarily prove that there is no God. It proves or illustrates something about the wondrous nature of God. All right? And so one of the people who made this idea most familiar to people who read his book was Francis Collins. You might know his name because he was the former director of the National Institutes of Health, like Fauci's boss during COVID. And he was also, prior to that, the person overseeing the Human Genome Project. So he's one of the nation's top scientists, and he also happens to be a Christian, a very committed Christian. And Francis Collins wrote a book called The Language of God, which in a sense says that when you study the human gene, or the genome, what you're seeing is God's language, right? And I first, I think, experienced this in physiology class in high school when I studied the eye. Like the eye is an immensely complex, is an organ or whatever it would be called, right? It's immensely complex. And so when you study the eye, it tells you something about how wondrous God's creation is, right? You're seeing God in that intricate knowledge. So, and that sort of brings up sort of a faith science issue too, which could be another course for another time. Okay, let's look at Dennis Edwards. I think I have all the quotes I need just right here. So this is a summary of Edwards, paraphrase. Edwards says, God created a world of complex and connected relationships in which natural processes have their own integrity, right? And that's an integrity that God respects. In creation, God enabled the world to run by itself on the basis of its own laws. So there's no need for outside intervention, again, because God designed it this way. Edwards explicitly argues for a non-interventionist approach, which I think reflects the world most of us see. Like, we don't see God constantly intervening, right, in every minute thing that happens in the world. We see it acting sort of on its own. So Edwards says it's really important to acknowledge that God respects creation. Like, God made it and God respects it. And this means that God doesn't constantly break into it and change it. So in terms of the problem of evil, this means that God is not causing evil, nor is God scripting the events that cause people to suffer. Now, last week I mentioned Bob Lydon's God scripting the events, whereas Bob is another Bob Lydon's phrase. Apparently one week when I missed adult ed, the problem of evil came up because of what was being discussed. And Bob apparently used the phrase, God is not scripting these events. And then he told me about that over coffee. And I thought, that's a really nice phrase. God is not scripting these events. That's pretty much what the non-interventionist approach says. Right? These things are happening, but they're not happening according to a script that God wrote in advance and is sort of making happen along the way. Okay, just a little bit more of Edwards. I think he makes this approach very clear, so you can decide whether you like it or whether you don't like it. The phrase Edwards repeatedly uses is that God acts in and through creaturely processes, and the reason he does that is because he wants to find a way for God to still act. Right? He doesn't want God to sort of be useless. So he says, however, that we can't know exactly how this working in and through actually happens. This view does not tell us how God acts in and through natural processes, and that's to be expected because God is incomprehensible. So Edwards says, a theology of divine action, which his book is about, should not spell out how God acts, but should insist that we can't know how God acts in and through creation. I didn't find this terribly helpful. This open, non-interventionist view does make it easier to see how God's not the cause of evil, but it makes it way more difficult to see where there's room for God to act. Right? So that's potentially a problem here. Edwards would like to see a space for God to act, but it remains difficult to see where this space is. So I think maybe this is coming up. I can't remember if this is in a slide that still exists or not. But I think Edwards saying this expresses a kind of worldview. A lot of us have been taught to see things this way, right? To see that somehow, at least in some things, God's involved. I can't say how, but it's a faith claim, right? And so it's a worldview, it's a faith claim. And I have a feeling that Edwards is partly driven by that, needing to see God even in ways that he can't really imagine how God is at work in the world. That's what I just said. Okay, so let me just summarize where we've been so far, and I need to try to leave a lot of time for conversation too. So, how does this view of God, how God's at work in the world, shape our way of looking at the problem of evil? I think it does so, again, by revising this proposition that God's all-powerful. So now the new non-dilemma is God is good, God is not in total control, so evil exists, right? Kind of makes sense. We might think if God was in total control, maybe evil wouldn't exist. But that's, according to this revision, that's not the way things are. So this means that God does not cause evil, but also that God does not appear to step in and interfere with nature, like to stop evil. It might cause one to say that God cannot stop every bad thing from happening. Although I was always taught as a child, you can never use God and cannot in the same sentence. So maybe cannot's not quite the right word, right? Except that maybe God cannot do that because God's already made a commitment to respect the integrity of creation. So it's that kind of cannot. Okay, so a few problems and challenges. And you might have already thought of some of these. There's several key ideas in the Christian tradition that become somewhat problematic or hard to explain with this non-interventionist approach, like prayer. Or miracles. Someone brought up miracles last week, right? And so I said I have no reason to deny that they ever happen, but it's hard to imagine how miracles would happen in this if you take the non-interventionist approach seriously. And in the last chapter, I think it's the last chapter of Kushner's book, what good then is religion, given everything he said? So I think another way of saying that is what good then is God? Right? If God sort of can't step in and change nature because of God's previous choices, what good is God? And the relational approach is a way of answering that question. Okay, so a non-interventionist God can still be seen as relational. I came across these two phrases several years ago and continue to find them somewhat helpful. Two ways of thinking about God. An active God in a responsive universe, or a responsive God in an active universe. So an active God, meaning God does things, makes choices, controls things, and things respond, right? The universe responds to what God wants to have happen. The alternative, which reflects this non-interventionist approach more closely, is that the universe acts, right? Things happen, and God responds to what happens. And that's what it would mean to see God as relational rather than controlling. So, how do we see God as relational? So here's just some quick summaries of some things people have said about that. I did bring along, John Polkinghorne has said a lot of really helpful things about this as well in this chapter on evil, a chapter on providence. So this verse, it's not a quote, but it's based on Polkinghorne. One way God is relational is through what we understand as the crucified God. Right? God enters into human suffering as a human person. Jesus becomes the crucified God. God is not just a compassionate observer from the outside. Right? God has become a fellow sufferer. And it's Lent, right? So this ought to make a lot of sense. People experience God's love and God's presence, right, subjectively, as a comforting reality in the midst of evil. And so we don't know exactly what God's doing, but I'm sure a lot of you would say, I've experienced God's love as a comforting reality during times of suffering, right? So it's in that way that we can think of God as relational. Or Jesus' life and teachings remain a positive, powerful force for good, right? So God's not inactive in the world when God's teachings, right, especially through the New Testament, through the life of Jesus, are a powerful force for good in the world, right? In a world that God's not controlling, right, but perhaps influencing in some very important ways. A couple more examples of this relational approach. The community of people who follow Jesus are an extension of God's relationship to the world. Right? So God relates to the world through us. And we often find great comfort in the care we receive from this community. And we also find encouragement from all of the things that people in this community are doing to try to respond to evil. We experience God's love as a source of hope, that suffering is not the whole story. Again, that's somewhat of a worldview, because it might be hard to think about how that happens, right? But if I ask the question, do you think love, divine love, is powerful enough to overcome evil? We'd probably say yes, right? Because the resurrection for Christians is a clear sign of that. Okay, so let's see. Oops, what happened here? So this brings us to my final point, practical theodicies. So if comfort phrases aren't a good approach, and if we accept the idea that God's not totally controlling everything that happens, a practical theology sort of fills that space. And this is how it fills that space. So again, this is actually a quote from Polkinghorne. He says, the ethical imperative to care for others would become meaningless if God always could be relied on for miraculous interventions to save people from bad consequences. Again, we might wish that God worked that way, but we know God doesn't always save people from bad consequences. And so there's an imperative for us to do what we can to save people from those bad consequences. A practical theology can be seen as an alternative to comfort phrases because they always contain hidden assumptions that try to resolve the problem by resolving the dilemma. This is very important. Resolving the dilemma does not do anything to eliminate the causes of suffering. Right? It changes nothing in the real world. So if somehow last week I figured out how to solve the dilemma without qualifying any of the propositions. Here's my solution. I can think, wow, that's really brilliant. I've never seen a solution, so it would be really brilliant. But what would be different in the world today now? Like if someone you know is dying prematurely of a disease, they'd still be dying of the disease. right? All of the horrible things that are happening all around the world that we read in the news all the time and in the nation, it'd still all be happening. So solving the dilemma might solve some problem, but it wouldn't solve the main problem. So a practical theodicy turns its focus on responding to evil and human suffering with acts of compassion and care, with real world human interventions. I'm going to skip that. So three very brief sort of illustrations, mostly through quotations, some of which you're familiar with, about practical theodicy. If we had a couple more weeks, and we do have a couple more weeks that we'll do some of this, like a practical theodicy is something we'll see, I think, when people come to talk about immigration. Then I think 2 weeks after that, we're talking about creation care. Right? Those are examples of practical theodicies. So Nicholas Berdyaev, who's a Russian philosopher and a Christian theologian, said this: "The paradox of suffering and evil, like the logical dilemma, is resolved, right, not logically, but it's resolved in the experience of compassion and love." I think this means, for example, that if we're troubled by the dilemma, when a bad thing happens, and we experience compassion and love, it doesn't give us an answer to the dilemma, but it, in a sense, resolves it for us, right? Because compassion and love are really powerful in the face of an unsolvable logical dilemma. Okay, that's Berdyaev. Dorothy Zola, who I used last week, and she has if you saw my book, it has about 50 little sticky notes coming out the edge because it's just very powerful. Lots of good stuff. Just a couple of things she says about this. Suffering is not a problem that can be solved merely by thought. To say that is like trying to walk toward places that cannot be reached by foot. Like if you have a travel problem, right, you want to get to Hawaii, you can't walk there. Right? So don't go there. Right? So that's what she's saying here. Don't try to solve it merely by thought. Instead, when we encounter suffering, we must ask, what are the causes of this suffering? And how can they be eliminated? To care about people who are suffering includes caring about the social, cultural, political, economic, and scientific causes. We should not only comfort them, but we should act to reduce the causes of their affliction. And here, for the physicians in the room, is what she says about medicine. She says it's a holistic approach that includes comfort care, but also surgical, medicinal, and lifestyle interventions, along with scientific investigation. So that's an example of a practical theodicy, right? Sort of real-life example that we've all experienced on, and some of us, both sides of that. And finally, a very familiar phrase. I used to have this memorized, but I don't anymore, so I'm going to have to read it. From Teresa of Avila, which I think is her answer to the question. She didn't say it this way, but I think it's her answer to the question, how do we stand with God in active resistance to evil? Well, this is how we do it, right? Again, because God has given us this role. She says, Christ has no body now but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which Christ looks with compassion on the world. Yours are the feet with which Christ walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which Christ blesses us now. So she doesn't come out and say, God's not intervening, right? It's all on you. But in a way, she's saying, I think, it's all on you, right? Because God's given you all these gifts, right, to respond to evil. So I'm going to stop there. Something for you to think about. And I thought last week all of your questions and comments really added a lot to the session. So hopefully you'll have some again. Bob?
I'd like to throw natural causes out of the conversation. You have stated that humans create culture and history, and we use that to interpret events. Pompeii was destroyed by a volcano. And we see that as a tragedy. It caused great suffering. But nature had nothing to do with that. Humans chose to build Pompeii where they built it. Not knowing, perhaps, that there was a volcano there, but nonetheless, they made that choice. And I guess the point I would make is, in that event, thousands of trees probably were destroyed. Innumerable wild animals were destroyed. We don't see that as a tragedy. We only see the death of humans as a tragedy. And I'd like to suggest that that's an inaccurate way to look at it. Why is it a tragedy for us and not for them? Nature just happens. There's no evil involved in that. It's the process that God set in motion.
Yeah. So that might, I think that's a really helpful comment, and it qualifies my definition of natural evil last time, right, by suggesting there's no such thing as natural evil. There's just nature at work. We see it as evil in the sense that we see people suffering from it. Maybe that we see, right, creation suffering from it, right? But one could easily call into question whether we should even use the phrase natural evil, right? Maybe it's just nature. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because something that's rolling around in my head is bad versus evil. I guess I struggle with the word evil with regards to natural consequences or nature in general. And I attribute that more to the moral piece.
Right. So in my definition of natural evil last time, I think I probably used bad as a synonym. Right. So it's easy, and moral evil is easier to see as evil because there's agency involved, and nature doesn't have agency in the same way. So it's a more difficult claim to make, right? That there's natural evil. So yeah, so your comment, Bob's comment, kind of go together. I think that the gist of it, however, in the problem of evil is that it causes immense, right? It causes immense suffering. David?
This is maybe a corollary question or comment, but I would love to have you tie it into what you're saying, and that is, number one is I think we're throwing out prayers for traveling mercies. You know, that phrase that people use.
Yeah.
What's going to happen is going to happen. It's open. That's according to some of these views.
And people might say some people who pray for traveling mercies get there safe and some don't, right?
Right.
So how, yeah.
But then how relationally we deal with what happened, either good or bad. So that's one sort of comment. The other question, I was thinking a lot this week on the basis of last week. What is the role of God's blessing? If God is at work in the world, what does it mean to be blessed by God? And why me and not you? Or why you and not me? And you know, the blessing and the curse parts of Scripture and the Psalms and all of that. Blessing and curse, blessing and curse. Do this and you will be blessed. Do that and you won't. And that's the moral evil part of it. But how do we view God's blessing in this view of God at work in the world now?
So if you'd asked me that earlier, I probably would have put that in the list of problems, right? Providence, prayer, miracles, God's blessing. Because it's hard to think about what that would mean if this approach makes sense, right? If God's not intervening, how's God blessing, right? But But that I think should be an open question that any of us could respond to. Does it still make sense to you in some way to think about God's blessing? And in the context of the fact that there are a lot of people God isn't obviously blessing? Right, so, there's a microphone back here, Tim.
Steve, you mentioned that you wanted to give us time for questions because it's a good thing for us to ask questions. But in order to do that, you had to give up control. And in giving up control, you have the possibility of these good insights, but also the possibility that I might ask some foolish question and, you know, whatever. So the two seem to go hand in hand, just like you're saying. So it seems like in this world after the fall where these bad things happen, we also have opportunities for courage and sacrifice and love and so on that we might not have had in a world without the fall. And so, I don't know, do you want to speak to that? What would we be doing if there were no fall? Would we just be watching Andy Griffith reruns and you know, with nothing of substance to do? The value of our life seems to come from some of these bad things that happen.
And that fits what sort of the Iranian approach to the problem of evil. Like the existence of evil is good for us, right? Because it brings about good in us.
Steve, the non-interventionist understanding of God also fits very well with our understanding of evolution. Mm-hmm. There was some mysterious creative force that brought the universe into being 13.8 billion years ago, and then through an extended process that Francis Collins describes of mutation and natural selection, God used that process to create us and this moment in the room here today. Two questions from that. One, is there any distinction between that non-interventionist view and deism? And secondly, I'd just say a little bit more, because it's been on the edge of some of our questions about the place of petitionary prayer in a compassionate, practical theodicy that you're talking about. I prayed this morning in bed, as I do before I get up, for people I care deeply about, and yet I sort of believe in a non-interventionist God, but maybe not completely. And so, do you pray petitionary intercessory prayer, and how do you theologize about that? So, two questions.
So let me do the deism question first. I was in an earlier draft. I was going to bring up the clockmaker God idea, right? Because this looks a lot like the clockmaker God. The difference might be the clockmaker God winds up the clock. And sets it in motion and is done with it. But the Christian God isn't done with it, right? So and if we could spend weeks talking about this whole idea of a relational God, right? The relational part of God is the God that's very unlike the clockmaker. So that's an attempt.
It's the God of the cross.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, for example, right? A Jesus who enters into human suffering. Right, praying for God to make something happen, to make something good happen, is hard for me because of the way I think about this non-interventionist God and all the ways that God doesn't seem
right, and your experiences with your mother.
Yeah, and then being able to see that in multiple situations through my life. And, so I wish that God answered all those prayers. If God doesn't answer all those prayers, then why doesn't God answer some of those prayers?
Right.
That leads us
so if I could be personal and push you a little bit, do you pray?
My prayers would tend to be prayers of thanksgiving that aren't thanksgiving for interventions.
Okay.
I'm thinking a couple of things. One is if you in your life, I in my life, and this is a very personal question, have believed that God did intervene in two situations that were life-saving, one for me and one for someone that I love. And there were clear ramifications either way that they would be a life and death situation. And one involved a decision made by another person to go in a direction, a literal direction, to take a road where they were able to actively intervene in saving my daughter's life at the time of her accident. So this is very personal. So I'm sure that I'm not the only one in this room that has had those kinds of experiences. And I wonder what other people who've had those experiences are thinking.
So should we just let others respond to that? Yeah, see where the mic goes next.
It's not on, though. You have to turn it on. You have to hold it on. No, you don't. You just have to turn it on.
When it's handed to you, it's normally on.
Okay, Scott.
I think two different thoughts. One simple one. Some is what I do. Some is also how I do it. There's a distinction there in our response and our theology. I think as far as framing specific events, the hardest thing that I have in wrapping my mind around it is if I look at one event, it is highly relational. If I step back and look at a small group of people, it's still relational, but it's a little more objective. If I step back to statistics of bad things happening to people of suffering, there's a bell curve involved. So where's this transition from here's a predictable response years from now or currently compared to something that's much more granular? My response is so different if it's granular and one person that I love and have a relationship with. It's hard to have that same response on a global scale. So how do I change my response and what I do and how I do it if it's someone I'm looking in the eye compared to a statistic?
So that sounds to me like a helpful comment that I don't need to respond to. It's very well said.
I think, I'm sorry. Okay. First of all, I have great compassion for the intervention and at least the life of a beautiful girl who was saved. And I'm so grateful you brought that up. I think that when I pray, I don't have quite in mind usually what I'm going to say. The point at which that intercessory prayer feels like God may be involved is that comes into my head at that moment. And it sort of feels like it's God and me working on what I'm saying. The other thing that the prayer that we have to say all the time is work for what you pray for. And so I think in a way, intercessory prayer changes me. If I'm praying for somebody I'm worried about, I'm more likely to go home and write them a note.
Yeah.
So I think intercessory prayer helps by bringing to our own minds what we want to do. And I remember the one time where I felt God was speaking directly to me, and I was very frustrated with some of the things happening. I think that was related to things happening at the college, actually. And I was sitting quietly and waiting to hear what I would say, and God sort of said, stop acting out of fear and anxiety, only act out of love. And I remember kind of asking back, but is this a message just for me? Is it for others? And so obviously today I've decided God meant it for others because now you've all heard it. So I guess some of the question that all of this brings is in these terrible times, what do I love so much that I'm willing to stand into the fray and try to make a difference? What do I love so much? Not what am I afraid of, and in a way that brings back to me your statement that God is love and God is that love intervention in the world.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Steve. Thank you for this fascinating and inspiring talk. There's an old Latin saying, ora et labora, which means work and pray. Pray and work, ora and labora. Next week, an example that Steve has already mentioned, we have a discussion about immigration, and it's a systemic kind of evil that we have to deal with, perhaps in response to what's happening at our national level about immigration. But next week, we urge you to come back. It's not going to be recorded, it's not going to be live streamed, but please come in person to hear Maggie Haveman Gould from Lighthouse Immigrant Advocates and Angel Lopez from Frontera de Gracia. And they will talk about issues of immigration and how locally we are responding and how we are responding at the border of Mexico. So please come back next week. Thank you very much.